Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What's your true supernatural, unexplainable, downright creepy story? Story 1. Something walked past.
When I was younger, we had a computer room in our house. It was located at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. At night, the faint glow of the computer screen would spill out into the hall, casting soft shadows and giving the space an eerie, almost otherworldly ambience. One night, I went down the hallway to use the bathroom. As I walked past the computer room, I glanced toward the open doorway. The glow from the screen illuminated part of the wall, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal. But then, something moved. It looked as though a figure walked in front of the computer screen, casting a shadow across the wall. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze in place. "Geez, you scared me," I blurted out, chuckling nervously, assuming it was one of my family members. But when I peeked into the room, there was no one there. The chair was empty, and the room was completely still, save for the gentle hum of the computer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I had just seen, or thought I had seen. Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, I told myself it was probably a trick of the light, or my imagination playing games with me. Yet the atmosphere in that room felt wrong, heavy, as if someone or something was watching me. I turned and quickly walked back to my room, my heart pounding with every step. From that night on, I avoided that bathroom, especially after dark. Even during the day, I would dart past the computer room without so much as a glance inside. Weeks later, I finally worked up the courage to share the story with a friend. They suggested that maybe it was just a reflection or some odd play of light. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something that defied explanation. To this day, I cannot pass a dimly lit hallway without remembering the shadow that should not have been there.
Story 2. Ghost in the Loft.
My family moved into a typical upscale suburban home. After spending a couple of years living modestly to save money, we managed to get a great deal on the house. Because it had been a model home before it became ours, it was fully staged with furniture to showcase the neighborhood's homes. The house had a loft area with 2 stairwells, one in the front and one in the back. Since the loft was so open, you could hear everything happening there from anywhere in the house. One day, my 2 best friends, a guy and a girl, were hanging out with me in the loft. We were all in high school, and they were a couple, often affectionate with each other, whether I was in the room or not. We were watching television when I got up to use the restroom. As I left, they were sitting close to each other. When I came back, they were sitting at opposite ends of the couch. I assumed they had an argument, so I asked what was going on. "Your little sister is home," my friend said. I froze. My face must have gone pale. "What is wrong?" the girl asked. I asked them why they thought my sister was home. They explained that they heard her laugh and run up the stairs, hitting her hands on each step like she was running on all 4s. My stomach dropped. I managed to stammer, "No one else is here." We checked the house to confirm. It was completely empty. Later, I found out that before it became a model home, another family had lived there. The little girl had been playing in the loft, climbed on the railing, and tragically fallen to her death below. although I never personally encountered anything in the loft. There was one recurring event I could not explain. Right next to where she had landed was the house's central intercom system. It had speakers in every room and could be used for communication or playing music. Occasionally at the exact same time each night, the intercom button would be pressed. It would emit a blank sound of static, like someone was holding the button but saying nothing. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor, and I had to go all the way down to the main unit to turn it off. Each time I half expected to see her standing there. Thankfully I never did, but the thought still lingers.
Story 3. The Ghostly Visit.
Last year, my mom and I stayed in a hotel for a short trip. It was an ordinary evening and I was in bed trying to sleep. The room was dimly lit by the streetlights outside, but something caught my eye. A human silhouette, distinct and dark, stood about 2 meters away from me, in the corner of the room. At first, I figured it was just a shadow, something that could be explained. But as I stared at it, something about the shape felt too real. I turned on the light, hoping it would go away. The moment the light flicked on, the silhouette vanished. I was relieved, but also confused. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. However, as soon as I turned the light off again, the shadow reappeared exactly where it had been. My heart began to race. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. But when I looked around the room, there was nothing that could have caused a shadow like that. The furniture hadn't moved, and there was nothing standing in the way of the light. I was too terrified to keep looking at it, so I turned my back and tried to sleep, though I barely could. I convinced myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning I told my mom about it. She didn't seem to think much of it. She shrugged it off, telling me I probably imagined it in the dark. Fair enough, I thought, but the shadow didn't come back that night or the next. A few days later, we were back home. My mom was busy in the kitchen and I was studying. Without turning around, she asked, "Do you remember that shadow of a person you saw at the hotel?" I froze. "Yeah," I replied cautiously. She then turned to me, her face pale, and quietly said, "I saw it too." My blood ran cold. My mom had been pretending she didn't see it because she didn't want to scare me.
Story 4. Midnight Footsteps.
When I was about 12, our family moved into a new house, new to us, but actually quite old. It was in our same village, but down a different lane. Part of the house used to be a bungalow, so my room and my sister's room were on the ground floor, down a long hallway. The entire ground floor had worn-up flooring, and there was a Persian rug outside the door to my room to avoid cold toes in the morning. Every night, around 11 p.m. or so, I would hear footsteps walking at a fairly slow pace down the hall, from the end guest suite, past our rooms, and toward the living room. I was always in bed when I heard them, and so was everyone else. You know how you can tell who a family member is by the way they walk up the stairs or open a specific door? I knew it wasn't anyone in my family. Plus, it was the sound of outdoor shoes clacking on the wood. And everyone in my family wore slippers inside the house. I would hear the footsteps start, fairly loud on the wooden floor way down the hall, coming up past my sister's room. Then there would be a pause while whatever it was walked over the rug. You could hear the gap in the footsteps. About 3 seconds. And then they would start again on the other side of the rug and fade out as they walked toward the living room. Then they would come back, same footsteps, breaking across the rug and resuming on the other side. I don't remember ever feeling scared, but I never went out to see what it was. I would fall asleep to the sound. It would go on for a really long time. It stopped about 3 or 4 weeks after we moved in, and I never heard it again. I didn't really think about it much after it stopped, but I've never forgotten it. As an adult, it makes me shiver to remember it.
Story 5. Missing Hour.
It was supposed to be just another trip across the country to settle into my new home. My brother was helping me, and we had borrowed a van to load everything up for the final stretch. Before we left, I glanced at my watch and called my girlfriend to let her know we'd be on the road soon. My brother checked the kitchen clock, but only mentioned it to me later. We set off, and due to the heavy load, we couldn't go faster than 80 km/h. The road was long, but the journey was manageable. As we took the off-ramp into my new city, my brother suddenly told me something that chilled me to the core. He said he couldn't remember the trip at all. When I thought about it, neither could I. We both assumed we were just tired, so we brushed it off and didn't think much more about it. When we finally arrived at my new house, my girlfriend greeted us, looking puzzled. She asked if we had broken the speed limit, because we had arrived almost an hour earlier than expected. My brother and I both stopped in our tracks, trying to process what she had just said. We retraced the route in our minds, but the only memory we could both clearly recall was passing a certain gas station and nothing else. After that, everything became a blur, until we found ourselves taking the off-ramp into the city. To this day, we have no idea what happened during that lost hour or how we could have traveled so fast. It seemed impossible. Not with any vehicle, especially one loaded with our belongings. We didn't break the speed limit, yet somehow we had arrived an entire hour earlier than we should have. I keep thinking back to the beginning of our trip, when my brother and I both independently checked the time. This is important because if one of the clocks had been wrong, it would explain things, but not both. I had also called my girlfriend just before we left, which meant there was a limited window for us to make the trip. And yet, something was off. Since that strange event, neither my brother nor I have experienced anything remotely similar. There are no odd dreams or strange marks on our bodies, nothing to explain what happened. But every time I think back to that missing hour, I can't shake the feeling that something more sinister happened that day. Something we may never understand, just 1 hour lost.
Story 6. Ground Zero.
In 2006, I was in New York for work. Our team finished early one day, and a few of us decided to head down to Ground Zero. None of us had ever been to New York before, and we had about 3 hours before we needed to be at a company dinner. We figured we had enough time to visit the site, take a quick walk around, and still make it back to freshen up for dinner. There were 4 of us who went. Before hopping on the subway, we all checked the time, ensuring we had enough time to explore without rushing. We made our way to Ground Zero and walked around, taking in the pictures and signs that were set up at the time. There was no museum yet, but the site felt very eerie and quiet, even amidst the usual bustle of the city. It was an overwhelming atmosphere, and we all felt a strange energy that we couldn't shake. We weren't there long before one of us said we needed to hurry. We'd been there almost 2 hours. I couldn't believe it. We'd only just arrived. But sure enough, when we checked our phones and watches, the time had passed much faster than we thought. Panic set in. There was no way we'd make it back, shower, and get ready for the dinner on time. And this wasn't just a casual dinner. This was an important meeting with our parent companies, and we needed to look presentable. We hurried back to the subway station, still trying to figure out how we would make it in time. We jumped onto the train, but the confusion only grew. All of us were in shock at how fast time had gone by. I glanced at my phone and noticed something odd. It was set an hour earlier than the time I had just seen at Ground Zero. I was sure I had checked it multiple times, and it had been a different time when I was at the site. I showed the others, and they checked their phones too. To our disbelief, every single one of us had the same thing happen. Our clocks had jumped ahead an hour. How could that be? None of us had set our clocks or watches. It was as if time had been altered in that very spot. We sat in stunned silence for the rest of the ride, unable to explain what had just happened. The experience gave all of us chills, and when we finally arrived at the dinner, we couldn't stop talking about it. One of our colleagues mentioned that they had also heard of strange occurrences in that area recently. It seemed like something was not quite right in that part of New York. To this day, none of us can explain what happened, but we all agree that there's something very unsettling about the energy at Ground Zero.
Story 7. Creepy Dream.
When I was around 10 years old, I had a dream that still freaks me out to this day. It started with me alone in my small house, surrounded by woods and several minutes away from the closest neighbor. It was daytime and everything seemed normal, until I heard the sound of something coming down the gravel driveway. The sound was like tires crunching, but much slower. I went out onto the porch to investigate, and what I saw made my blood run cold. An old-fashioned covered wagon, pulled by nothing but the slow creak of the wheels. For reasons I couldn't explain, a deep sense of dread filled me. I immediately ran back inside and locked all the doors. My heart raced as I crept down the staircase into the basement, where I knew I could see the man through the small window in the door. I watched, my pulse pounding, as the wagon came to a halt right in front of the window. The man, wearing a black suit and a top hat, stepped down from the wagon and looked directly at me through the glass. The terror that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever felt. The man held my gaze for a long moment, then walked to the back of the wagon. He pulled off the cover to reveal what was inside. Several lifeless bodies hanging from the supports at the top of the wagon. Their feet dangled and their necks were wrapped in rope. But what happened next was beyond belief. The man did something, and to my horror, their heads began to inflate. The bodies' faces turned red as their eyes bulged out in grotesque exaggeration, looking almost cartoonish. But the worst part, he never stopped looking at me, as though he knew I was watching and enjoying the terror I was feeling. I was sure he was going to do the same thing to me. I woke up in sheer terror. To make it worse, the power had gone out, and it took me forever to stumble through the dark to my parents' room, where I spent the rest of the night on the floor, too scared to sleep. Here's the truly chilling part. Years later, my family was talking about strange dreams, and I thought I could finally share this one. I hesitated, but eventually began recounting the nightmare. When I got to the part about the man with the top hat, my younger sister's face went pale. She asked me, was the man wearing the top hat? We were both stunned. We had never discussed this dream before, yet we remembered so many of the details the same way. I still can't explain how we both had the same exact dream, especially since I never told anyone about it because it felt too weird to share. To this day, it's the most unsettling dream I've ever had, and the coincidence still sends chills down my spine.
Story 8. Footsteps that wouldn't stop.
My aunt's house has always been known to be haunted. She moved there when my cousin was only 2 years old. From the moment they arrived, she knew something was off. But the ghosts, as it turned out, weren't malicious, so she decided to stay. Over the years, my cousin, now about 30, grew up knowing the house was haunted. My 2 younger cousins had the same experience. They would talk about the ghosts like it was just a normal part of life. Being someone who loves spooky things, I was naturally fascinated by their stories. At every family gathering, I'd hear them casually talk about it, and eventually, I asked my aunt if I could spend the night at her house. I was about 17 at the time, and I wanted to experience the haunted house for myself. That night, things started off normally. My aunt, my cousin, and her friend were watching Carrie in the living room. It was winter, and all week the fireplace had been out of order. As we watched the movie, my cousin half-jokingly said, "When is this movie going to get scary?" Just then, the glass patio door in the kitchen opened on its own, sending a cold draft through the room. After the movie, we went outside to the hot tub to warm up. After some time, we came back inside, and to our surprise, the fireplace was blasting full heat. My aunt just laughed it off, saying it was the ghosts messing with us. Apparently, this was something they did often. Later, after everyone went to bed, I was laying on the couch while my cousin slept on the floor next to me. That's when I heard it. Footsteps coming up from the basement. The basement door was in full view, and I could hear the slow, deliberate steps as they climbed the stairs. The steps stopped at the top of the stairs, and I braced myself for someone to come through the door, but there was nothing. A moment passed, and then the steps began descending the stairs again, only to repeat the cycle, up and down, over and over. I was terrified. I woke my cousin and whispered, "Listen, listen." The footsteps were crystal clear. Someone or something was walking up and down the stairs. He looked at me, unfazed, and said, "Dude, that happens every night. Go back to sleep." I couldn't believe it. The footsteps continued for about 30 minutes, and I was left mortified, too scared to sleep. I've experienced more strange things at my aunt's house since then, including lights turning on and off, and more footsteps. My aunt believes the spirits might be children, and it makes sense. They live right across the street from a school, where other people have also reported strange activity.
Story 9. Ghost that walked among us.
When I was a baby, my family lived in a large old manor house with my grandparents. One night, something terrifying happened that would change my family's life forever. My dad woke up in the middle of the night to see what appeared to be a ghostly figure of my mum hovering over the bed. She was screaming and trying to get into my mother's sleeping body. The sight terrified him so much that he refused to ever go back to the house. and soon after we moved out. A few years later, when I was about 6, we had settled into a new apartment. One cold winter morning, my mum got up to make a warm cup of milk for the two of us. It was early, the lights in the room were off, but the corridor lights were on. As I stood there, half awake, I noticed something strange. I could see the dust in the air shifting, coming together in a form. At first it was just a blur, but then it solidified into a ghostly apparition of my mum. But this wasn't my mum as I knew her. This version was dressed in clothes that looked like they were from the 1800s. The ghost walked right past me without even acknowledging my presence. It was as if it was completely unaware of me, its focus entirely on following my mum as she moved through the apartment. I stood frozen in place, completely mesmerized by the sight. It was the most surreal thing I've ever witnessed, and to this day I can still remember it vividly. The image of that ghostly figure, dressed in outdated clothing, trailing after my mum, still haunts me.
Story 10. Series of unexplainable events.
We lived in a house that was undeniably haunted. The strange occurrences began shortly after we moved in, and over time they became more frequent and unsettling. One of the oddest things that would happen was a door on the side of the house, leading from the deck into the kitchen. A couple of times a day, without fail, we would hear a loud, sudden bang. It sounded as though someone had kicked the door with all their might, shaking the entire frame. The sound would echo through the house. It wasn't the wind, nor was anyone there to cause it. The door would rattle with a violent force, but there was no one in sight. One afternoon I had a friend over, and we were sitting in my room, which was located just off the entryway. Suddenly we both heard the front door open. It was unmistakable, the creak of the door and the faint sound of footsteps. We saw someone walk in, heading straight down the stairs to the tenant's apartment. We both saw it clearly. It seemed normal at first, until I noticed that the tenant's car wasn't in the driveway. Curious, we went downstairs to check. But when we reached the bottom, the house was completely empty. All the doors were locked, and there was no sign of anyone having entered. But it wasn't until one particular night that things took a much darker turn. I was home alone, talking to my girlfriend on the phone. I was sitting in the family room, completely alone. Above me was the loft, which opened to the main area of the house. As I spoke to my girlfriend, I suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the loft. They were slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking back and forth. I froze, staring at the staircase that led to the loft. I turned to look, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The air was thick with silence. I turned back to continue my conversation, but just as I did, the footsteps resumed. They started again, slowly, almost like they were taunting me. This went on for several minutes, each time stopping when I looked, only to start up again when I turned away. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Unable to take it any longer, I decided I had enough. I grabbed my things, hung up the phone, and left the house in a hurry. I drove straight to my girlfriend's house, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.